Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the podcast. I'm not Coco.
And I'm not Daltz.
And this week we are going to talk about the Aaron Hernandez documentary. Coco, did you watch this?
I did. I watched it with you, as a matter of fact. It was just released on Netflix about a week and a half ago, so we watched it a couple days after it came out.
Did you want to give the listener a summary of the podcast?
Are we going to be able to have sponsorship opportunities if you're always talking like that? I don't know if...
This is the way I talk around the house all the time. Could you pass the salt, please?
I think you burned those cookies.
This beer delivery brought to you by Purelator. Anyway, summary of the podcast. A summary of the...
Now we're really not going to get any sponsorship opportunities.
Well, yeah. So do you want to tell us what's going on?
Yes. So the limited series is for your viewing pleasure on Netflix. It's called Killer Inside, The Mind of Aaron Hernandez.
On Netflix.
Which I said. For those of you who...
It's on Netflix, by the way.
...have been living under a rock for the past 10-ish years, Aaron Hernandez was a player for the New England Patriots. He was convicted of murdering a friend of his in 2015. He was acquitted of killing 2 other men in 2017. He did a lot of really violent things, is suspected of maybe having a hand in some other deaths. And he killed himself in prison 5 days after his acquittal, after a couple awesome DJs in Boston outed him on the radio and then made some really terrible jokes about wide receivers and tight ends.
And when you say awesome, you mean not awesome.
I mean,
you mean
the opposite of awesome.
Completely uncool and actually
right.
A D-bag.
Exactly. So that is really...
So the documentary series covers that exclusively.
It covers his whole life, because he was only like 27, 28 years old when he killed himself. It covers his childhood in Bristol, Connecticut, home of ESPN.
And not far from the studios here of Coco and Daltz.
At Chincoosy Shores.
Chincoosy Shores.
It also covers his time at the University of Florida, where he was a player, and then it covers his time with the Pats. It covers...
His time in jail.
His time in prison. It had some exclusive audio of calls that he made from prison to his friends, his former college teammates, his fiance, his mother, his family members. Mm-hmm. So the Boston Globe also did a podcast series on Aaron Hernandez, I believe in 2019. It was called Gladiator. It was very, very good. I enjoyed it a lot. It went into more detail about pretty much everything, but it didn't have, as far as I can remember, the audio of the prison calls. I believe the producers of this series got those from a Freedom of Information Act request. So those were...
They were good.
They were really good.
And they were part of the Spotlight department that's at the Boston Globe.
Right.
Famous for the movie Spotlight.
You always got to bring Spotlight up. That's your
Spotlight,
favorite movie.
It's top 3.
So what did you think about the limited series on Netflix, Daltz?
I thought it was good. It was very comprehensive. Even though I come from the sports world, theoretically, I didn't know a lot about the story. I just sort of knew headlines and that sort of thing, because I'm not really a football guy, or hand egg, as it probably should more appropriately be called. But I was interested in this documentary because I love documentaries, and it was something that actually was not that far removed from my life, because when I was at ESPN formerly.
What? You worked at ESPN?
Yes, wow. at a large media conglomerate, maybe I should say that, located in Bristol, Connecticut.
Like you're a contestant on a game show.
Right. Where do you work? I work at a large entertainment and sports programming network. So when I was there was talk in the office about the police force at Bristol searching a nearby lake for a murder weapon. And so that was connected to the Aaron Hernandez case. So I had this interest a little bit on the side, periphery kind of interest in the case. So I thought it was very interesting. I thought it was very well spaced and timed in terms of the amount of information they gave out. And then they teased you a little bit, and then they didn't unveil everything in the first episode. And they also didn't take 8 episodes to unveil the information like some documentaries that we've seen that I will not mention, but you can go ahead and mention if you want to.
Right. It was 3 hour-long episodes, so that's pretty That's doable.
That's good enough.
Yeah, you can do that in one night.
Yeah, you don't want to sum somebody's life up in 3 hours, but there are a lot of people that don't get 3 hours to sum up their life. So I think that was pretty good. This story starts, obviously, it off the top starts with the sensationalism of the murder and everything like that, but it goes really deep into his life. He was raised by an abusive dad. He had a brother. He had a mother who was not spectacular, but who knows how much of that had to do with her character and how much had to do with the fact that she was married to this guy who wasn't great. And then it goes on and talks about his high school career, and then he talked to people that he touched in their careers and high school friends and things like that. And it's a very fascinating story of how nature and nurture can turn you around and spin you in different directions. And you look at his brother. His brother was not an elite athlete.
Well, his brother did play football at UConn.
Yes, true. And Aaron Hernandez was supposed to go in that direction too, and that's dealt with as well. But he was a very good athlete, let's say that, and not an NFL level athlete. But by all accounts, is not involved in any kind of nefarious, funny business. And so it was a very interesting dynamic from the beginning of the family structure and outside influences and everything like that. So I really liked the approach. I liked the fact that it was fairly easy to watch. It wasn't a lot of redundant information like that other documentary we saw where you kept repeating the same stuff over and over again. It's like, okay, you told me that already. But yet it did it tactfully, so it reminded you of certain things that you needed to know without hitting without the big, huge drone video panning out to the village as we saw in that other documentary. That kind of thing. The
disappearance of Madeline McCann. That's the one that he's talking about.
Thank you.
You can just say that.
Thank you. Well, I knew you were going to do it.
You can just say it.
So that one, not so good, but the Hernandez one, very good. What did you think, Coco?
Well, I also used to work at a large media conglomerate in Bristol, Connecticut.
Did you really?
I did. That's not where we met, surprisingly.
Wow. We met at a different conglomerate.
We did.
Not large.
Not large at all. Not even really a conglomerate.
Not existing pretty much anymore.
Right. All this stuff happened after I left, so I'm sure if I had still been there, it would have been a crazy feeding frenzy. But it's impossible not to hear about it while it's going on. Mm-hmm. So I didn't follow it closely, but I definitely got the highlights as it was going on. So the documentary series, like I said, it didn't go into as much detail as the Gladiator podcast. Pretty much everything kind of seemed like it was information that I already knew from the podcast, but I don't want to say I quote unquote enjoyed the recordings of the phone calls because that's not the right word, but
it was good value added to the documentary.
It was definitely good value added because you get so much more when you actually hear his own voice and you hear his own words, and he can say things that other people can only maybe speculate on.
Well, it was a real window into his character because, like you said, it was him talking, and since he's deceased, you can't get an interview with him and say, well, what were you thinking here? And we can only speculate what he was thinking, obviously, but it gives you greater grounds for that speculation.
Right, and that's the thing with both the podcast and the docuseries. Nobody has an answer to why.
Right.
Like, nobody knows why he killed the guy he was convicted of killing, and nobody knows why... I mean, it was ridiculous. Like, the two people he was acquitted of killing, like, they think it might have been because, like, one of them spilled a drink on him in a nightclub.
Right.
So, and he's not around to answer those questions anymore. So nobody knows why. And it was very, I mean, clearly he made a lot of really terrible decisions and affected a lot of people's lives extremely negatively. Like, the people who died, their families, his daughter, who was, I think, 4 years old when he killed himself. She's going to grow up without a father. His fiance is left to pick up the pieces.
Yep.
His brother, his extended family members who he was close with. Like, everybody's lives are shattered because he made a lot of really completely terrible decisions. So, but at the same time, it's not completely black and white because even though he made those terrible decisions, well, he had an abusive alcoholic,
Right.
domineering father.
Complicating factors.
He had a narcissistic mother. He was closeted. So, which is not, especially in the football culture. And then, yeah. So,
which we haven't even gone into. We haven't even
Right.
mentioned that a large part of this docuseries, as opposed to some of the other ones that have been out there, it dwells a lot on his sexuality, and in terms of whether he was comfortable with it, whether he was, like you said, he's in the testosterone-fueled world of football, and how comfortable are guys going to be in the locker room if they find out one of their teammates is gay, or if they are gay, and how are they going to be? And so that was one of the things I thought was very interesting too, as a little sidelight, was a former teammate of his, and they dealt on the Patriots, and they dealt with his struggle with the fact that he was gay and trying to reconcile that with playing football and everything like that. And to me, that was a lot of, I didn't know any of that stuff. I didn't know anything about Aaron Hernandez in that regard, and I didn't know anything about the fact that he struggled with it, obviously. So that was a real interesting layer to the documentary, that we all contain multitudes, right? That old saying.
Yeah.
And there's no greater example than Aaron Hernandez, because he, like you said, on the surface, he's this homicidal maniac and narcissistic and perhaps a psychopath. And yet you've got all this baggage that he's got, and not excusing it, and not
Right.
in any way, shape, or form defending what he did.
And
but
his
it's just
autopsy,
complicated.
showed that he was suffering from acute CTE
Right.
when he died. And he was only 27, 28 years old. And he's been playing football since he was in, grade school, middle school? So,
Yeah. So he's been dealing with that. So who knows how much of that was a factor. The CTE, which we didn't obviously mention till now, is also a huge part of this story. And it's an underlying theme to, in my mind, as somebody who's followed sports and has played hockey and has probably had a couple of concussions and understands what that can do to a person. And then you're dealing with, so he's got CTE at a very young age when his frontal cortex is not developed. He's dealing with the fact that he's closeted. He's dealing with the fact that his dad is very abusive and not supportive at all, not the kind of dad that you would want. And then all this other stuff, you add that to the fact that he's a teenage boy growing up in America, and so all the baggage that comes with that. So it was very heartbreaking in a lot of ways. Not defending Aaron Hernandez, but just defending, like, this kid seemed like he was sort of sweet in some ways, and he had a smile and everything like that, and it went all bad in a hurry.
Right. Both things can be true. He made a lot of really bad decisions that shattered a lot of people's lives, but he also had a very tragic life himself.
Right.
And any one of those things that we just mentioned would be enough to break the strongest people. And he had he was dealing with all of it.
Yeah.
And
that's why I love documentaries so much, is because they reveal real struggles and you believe them because it's the truth. Whereas if you introduce this kind of stuff in a movie, it would have been just too complicated, right? Okay, so the guy's closeted, he's got CTE, he's got an abusive dad, and he's 20 years old playing in the NFL. This is unbelievable.
Well, this is one thing I do wish, though, is that they would have gone into more detail about certain stuff. Like you said, he's 20 years old and playing in the NFL. They very briefly mentioned that he had to go to the NFL at 20 years of age because Urban Meyer, the coach at the University of Florida at the time, told him, "You're not coming back for your senior season."
And why did he say that?
Well, why did he say that?
And he was a good performer on the field.
Right, exactly. Like, that was in the golden age of Tim Tebow, where the Gators were winning lots of national championships. So,
and Urban Meyer is not exactly one who should be casting stones.
Right, exactly. So clearly Urban Meyer is not going to sit down with these people and have a tell-all interview, but you're telling me
he's still employed, right?
Right. Well, he's not at Florida anymore, but he's still
a coach.
Right. So you're telling me you couldn't get one of his former teammates to come on and be like, coach was really angry about blah, 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 or Aaron got into a fight with Tebow and coach said, Tebow's our guy, so I'm not going to keep you around. Like, you're on Netflix. You don't have the 22-minute issue that network TV has, right? Like, you've got as much time as possible. So why don't you go into detail about that? And then there was another issue when they were talking about, they were trying one of his trials. I think it might have been the trial he got acquitted in. They wanted to introduce evidence of his mindset. And allegedly he had a pen pal that he had written to and said, it's really difficult, my sexuality, I can't be who I want to be, I can't be who I am, and so that makes me act out and do all these terrible things because I'm not allowed to be myself. And it ended up not being able to be introduced into evidence. So they just had this 2 or 3 minute mention of it, and then it went away, and I'm like,
what was that?
Could you not find the pen pal? Like, could you not find somebody who... And I understand the whole needing to be sensitive to his family, his daughter and his fiance who are left. And I understand, well, maybe they approached the pen pal and the pen pal didn't want to come forward. But why don't you say that then? Why don't you say...
Right.
So I understand...
We contacted them or they wouldn't...
Right, exactly. Especially because when he killed himself, he left, I think, 3 letters, and one of them was to his prison boyfriend, so who has come forward and shared the contents of that letter. So
why not?
Why not?
There were a couple of holes, but to me, they weren't significant enough to hold me back on the story. Like, I think I was learning, and maybe the same is the case with you, is that I was looking at it more from a balance/journalism perspective, and like, well, what, you can't just dish this off and say Urban Meyer didn't want him to come back. It was like, that's a huge hole in a journalistic story. Like, if you want to, it's like, well, maybe there's a turning point there. Maybe there's something else going on, or maybe the administration there found out about the funny business that he had been involved with, which we didn't mention, down in Florida, and he got away with. There was some violence that he was involved with.
Yeah, like he
at a club.
A bartender tried to make him pay his bar tab, and
imagine the nerve,
right? And he didn't think he should because he's a football player, so he sucker punched the guy and busted his eardrum, and
debilitated the guy in a serious way, and then yet no charges were laid.
Yeah, no charges. So
hello, Florida.
Right. Well, hello, the privilege of being a football player in Florida in this particular school. Right. I mean, that stuff goes on in every football town. Yeah,
which is sad. And that's also an indictment of the system. This documentary is an indictment of the system, because if he had gotten some help at that level when he was young, very young, and very impressionable, then maybe he wouldn't have done what he did. I mean, if somebody had taken him under his wing and said, listen, if you're going to be a pro, you got to act like a pro. Don't be doing this. Don't be doing that. And now I know a lot of pro teams, football teams, NHL teams, I know, they have these kind of counselors now, and they guide you and they tell you, don't do this and don't do that, and make sure that, the woman is not lifting your wallet when you're going home with her and stuff like that, like all these precautionary tales that they tell. So I don't know if he got that. I have no sense of that one way or the other, but it certainly wouldn't have hurt.
Well, and that was another thing that I didn't understand when before he got arrested, before he murdered the guy he was convicted of killing, he had another associate who he was paranoid, like they had like a bust up, and he was paranoid that guy was going to come after him, and he went to the Patriots and said, like, I'm really paranoid, this guy is, like coming after me.
My life might be in danger.
And you can't freaking tell me that the NFL doesn't have protocols for that.
Right.
Because there's...
The New England Patriots, too.
Especially the Pats with superstars like Brady and Belichick.
Right. We're not talking about the, the Kansas City Scouts.
Right, the Charlestown Chiefs.
The Chiefs.
Right.
Yeah. Or the Arizona Cardinals or something like that.
Right. Like,
This is a big league franchise.
You can't tell me that they don't have protocols in place for that. But instead of saying, okay, so you're in your house, we're going to get your video monitoring system set up, we're going to hire like these bodyguards, we're going to hire security to post at the perimeter, we're going to do all these things. They rented him like a freaking flop house in an unsecured building somewhere in Boston.
Right.
And I understand that he was dealing with a lot of heavy mental things, and perhaps he just needed to go somewhere and just smoke some weed and get away from the responsibilities of being an NFL player and being a family man. But that's not how you go about helping somebody who's getting death threats.
Well, you don't isolate a guy who clearly needs to not be isolated. He clearly needs some help. He clearly needs some guidance. He clearly needs some adult supervision.
Right.
You don't abandon him. You don't bail on. You don't bury him somewhere figuratively, in this random apartment complex where the neighbor was like, I could smell the ganja. It was coming through the walls. Like Aaron Hernandez is in there just smoking up a storm because he's so anxious.
Right.
And he's all by himself as far as we know. So like that's the worst way you could deal with that kind of stuff.
And to be fair, I don't know if maybe they said, do all these things, and he was like, no, I don't want to do that. But your next step after saying, do all these things, and he turns it down, isn't to say, well, let's go get you an apartment in some crap hole somewhere so you can just smoke your weed in peace. Like, any criminal worth their salt is going to be able to find you and follow you to the flop house and bust in because there's no security. Like,
well, it was definitely enabling by the NFL, and there is some enabling by the NFL here too, because there's win at all costs.
Right.
And Hernandez was doing the job on the field. He was a great player on the field. And Tom Brady in one scene where I don't even remember that scene where it was sort of like a grainy video, and he was in a scrum, and I think he was talking to. Maybe it was
Gronk.
Maybe, but somebody was saying, "Hey, how's it going? What's going on?" He said, "Oh, I got to keep an eye on Hernandez. He's a lot of work," or something like that. It was just like an offhand comment, but it meant a lot when you look at the layers that are beneath that story. And the other part of it is when I was saying that there was some enabling going on, is that the CTE part of it, and then Robert Kraft at the end saying, I recommend your kids play football because it's the greatest game. And that to me that's a betrayal to kids across America, because it's not a risk-free game that the owners are portraying it as. And so there's a lot of up and down in this that's really interesting.
Well, the players are just a commodity, right? I mean, Hernandez had served his usefulness in Florida, so they got rid of him. So he went to the NFL, and then as soon as a whiff of scandal enveloped him, the Pats cut him loose. The NFL didn't want anything to do with them.
They cut him,
yeah, so he's...
But meanwhile, a lot of this stuff had happened on their watch.
Right.
So they're not 100% responsible because individuals are responsible for their own actions. Right. But at the same time, by the sounds of it, they didn't help him very much.
Right. They totally dropped the ball when he did go to them.
And you didn't say that on purpose.
I did not say that on purpose. And that's the thing that... Like, you look at this guy, he's 27, 28 years old when he kills himself. He's a very handsome guy. He's got a beautiful fiance, a beautiful daughter. He's playing in the NFL, which an incredibly tiny percentage of people actually get to do.
Right.
He's making $40 million at it.
Right.
He's got a mansion in Boston, one of the best cities in the country. Like, he's set for life. He should be living the American dream. All he had to do, no pun intended, was stay on the straight and narrow, right? And so when he went to the Pats, like, maybe, if they could have said, like, bro, you need to get some help, you need to get things together, you're spiraling out of control, like, if he could have gotten that help,
who knows?
Who knows? Like, maybe all this stuff wouldn't have happened, and maybe it still would have, because he still felt as though he couldn't be his authentic self. But
well, and also with the CTE, we shouldn't discount the long-term effects of that. So as the NFL has admitted to in some lawsuits, not necessarily culpability, but in certain cause and effect ways, that the game causes CTE and the effects of it. So you've got the legendary players who have died. Junior Seau, he saw him, a teammate at one point.
Yeah, Junior Seau, he killed himself when I was at the large sports conglomerate in Bristol, Connecticut, and I, for some reason, completely forgot that he shot himself in the chest.
Yeah, so he could have his brain examined.
He could have his brain examined. I completely forgot about that.
When you're around that kind of stuff, and you see the legendary Pittsburgh Steelers who had same issues and deteriorated very rapidly in their 40s, that might have been another part of it. Again, all speculation because we don't know what was going on inside his mind, but honestly, there was a lot going on with this guy inside his mind, is the bottom line.
And nobody thinks of that when they're 20 years old. Nobody thinks, in 45 years, my brain is going to be Swiss cheese.
Right.
All they see is $40 million and...
Understandably.
And chicks.
Understandably. And if you're 20 years old, that's the perfect scenario for you. You're not dealing with the future. You don't care about the future.
Right. When you're 20 years old, 45 seems like...
100 years from now.
100 years from now. But then you blink and... It's here,
And that's where you need an adult. That's where you need a really good agent, advisor, family friend, somebody who is older, has been there, and can tell you, or at least lay out, here are the dangers of your situation. So if you're going to do this, here's the cause and here's the effect.
Right.
If you're comfortable with that, then go ahead. But at least have that knowledge before you go ahead. And it didn't sound like he had any of that. His parents were a mess. He had an older cousin that he was very close to, but she was dealing with cancer and didn't seem like she was 100% on the straight and narrow either.
And she passed when he was in prison,
And
didn't
she died when he was in prison. So that was another, there were a couple of turning points. One was when his dad dies when he was 16.
And that was what caused him to go to the University of Florida.
Right.
Like, they were a big UConn family, so he was set to go to UConn and be with his brother. And then his dad died, and he was like, smell you later, Connecticut.
Yeah, I'm out of here as fast as possible.
Yeah.
And then when his cousin died, that was a huge turning point as well, because that was his only support. Essentially, his cousin was the unconditional love that a mother or a father usually was provided by this cousin. And when she was gone, then that was a support network he didn't have, and it further knocked him down. And again, it's tragic all the way around, this story. It's tragic, obviously, for the families who are affected by the murders, first and foremost, but also just the fact that this is an everyday, all-American kid success story that just is completely sour. It's just awful.
Yeah, like what could have been if he could have gotten some help.
Some help, yeah. Or not play football.
Right.
There's that.
Right.
So overall, what did you think, Coco? I think we talked it up pretty good, that it was a good docu-series.
It was. Like I said, I would recommend the podcast that the Boston Globe did, but this was very good as well. So
would you recommend one over the other, or a supplement to one?
I would recommend the podcast over the docuseries, but like 60-40, because they tread a lot of the same ground. Like, there wasn't a lot in one that wasn't in the other. So what about you, being the non-football fan? I
thought it was good. As far as telling a story, I thought it was good. It was very reminiscent of the 30 for 30 series. It was almost like an extended 30 for 30. And this subject needed that kind of treatment, more than an hour or whatever you have.
Yeah, it was kind of reminiscent of the OJ 30 for 30,
right.
Like the 5-part, we're going to delve into racism and OJ's background. And
Yeah, so I could see the company known as ESPN having done this kind of thing, or at least being offered it. But now with Netflix around, they're taking it on. So yeah, I recommend it. It's very good. It's 3 hours, but it doesn't feel like 8. It doesn't feel like 20. It feels like the right amount of space and time for this kind of subject. A very complicated subject, not just what you think it's going to be, a story about this guy. There's so many layers. It was really well done, I thought. Yeah, just in time for Super Bowl Sunday next weekend. Oh, yes. The Pats are not going to be in. Surprisingly. I know you're broken up about that, too. A resident of New England for 15 years, not a Pats fan. What? I know. Well, neither are you. So. No, neither am I. But you're not a St. Louis Cardinals fan either, because they're no longer there as a football team. No, nor am I a St. Louis Rams fan either, because they're no longer there. Because they're no longer there either. Yeah. What's with St. Louis and the football teams? They're just like slipping out of their fingers. I know. I currently have no NFL country. Yeah, right. I'm looking for a team. Neither do I. I'm a big Toronto Argonauts fan, so there you go. Oh, there you go. Go Argos. All right. Argos. And take the Maple Leafs with you. Ba-dum-psh. So for another week, another podcast. I'm shaking my head and you can't see it, listener. You could probably hear it, though. You could hear it. So thanks for joining us on this spectacular day here in Connecticut, and we hope you are all well and enjoying avocado dip wherever you are in preparation for the Super Bowl. That was awkward. Okay. So for another week, thanks for joining us. I'm not Coco. And I'm not Dalt.